On this special edition of NewsVision, we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of Everglades National Park, a World Heritage Site, a biosphere reserve, and a wetlands of international importance.
The Everglades is a super unique ecosystem. It is the only ecosystem like it in the entire world.
We bring you team coverage from the field, from examining the long, rich history of the Everglades and its vital significance to Florida.
A lot of Floridians make a living out of this.
To why the wetlands were nearly obliterated in the 20th century.
It's this place that we essentially, destroyed half of it, and we've crippled the other half.
We take a closer look at the massive efforts to restore and preserve the Everglades.
This is the most expensive ecosystem restoration project in the entire world, but it's worth it.
Plus, we uncover the secrets of the swamp, from endangered and invasive species to some unique sites off the beaten path.
We want to protect the Everglades, and we want to make people aware of the Everglades.
And we look ahead at what the future of this one-of-a-kind ecosystem holds.
The Everglades is a test. If we pass, we may get to keep the planet.
Hello and welcome to this special edition of UMTV's NewsVision from one of the most fascinating and important places in the world, the Florida Everglades. I'm Sophia Vitello.
And I'm Daryl Barnes. Thank you for joining us. The Everglades National Park was inaugurated in December 1947, and all throughout 2023, it's celebrating its 75th anniversary.
And what you see around us is called the Anhinga Trail, one of the most popular trails in the park, and it's also part of the U.S. National Register of Historic Places.
Yeah, and we at the University of Miami are very fortunate to live close to this ecosystem that's truly one of a kind. And we're here today to introduce you to it. From its rich history to the numerous benefits it provides for millions of people to the serious challenges it's faced with and the gigantic efforts to restore and preserve it.
The Everglades National Park is only 75 years old, but the wetlands that you see here have been around for at least 5,000 years.
Before it was the place to go for airboat tours and seeing wild gators, well before becoming the largest environmental restoration project in history, this was the Everglades. A massive unmarked piece of land that early explorers called uninhabitable.
When the first Spanish came in the 16th century, they immediately told the king that it was liable to overflow and of no use. It was swampland.
The Swamp. That's the title of the book Grunwald wrote in 2007 about the Everglades. It's a title that represents the negative attitude people initially had towards the area. But in fact, this place is an environmental treasure.
The Everglades is a super unique ecosystem. It is the only ecosystem like it in the entire world.
Home to thousands of native plant and animal species, the Everglades are 7,800 square miles of wetlands, where water slowly flows from the Kissimmee River near Orlando all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. There is some evidence of prehistoric people living in the Everglades some 15,000 years ago, when the area was an arid landscape. The Calusa, the Tequesta, the Seminole, and the Miccosukee were the only humans who lived in the Everglades for hundreds of years, up until the 19th century. These natives called the land Pehioku, which means grassy water. White explorers went through a few names on their maps, but settled on the phrase Everglades. Glades after the tall sawgrass that grows in the shallow water, and ever because it looked like that grassy water went on forever. Throughout the colonialism era, the Spanish Empire claimed this land in what they called East Florida, but they never actually lived there. So with no use for it, Spain gave up its claims to Florida in 1821, leaving it to the growing United States. And when Americans started moving in, they realized something. The land underneath the shallow water was extremely fertile, and if they got rid of the water, they could use it to grow crops.
This was the age of manifest destiny, when Americans believed that we were kind of destined to tame the wilderness and turn it into something amazing for all mankind. And the Everglades was the wilderness.
In 1909, Americans began draining the Everglades, creating a land boom, and pushing out the natives so they could farm crops like sugarcane. And with business booming and all this new cheap land, Florida became a hotspot for developers.
This has been a place that was settled by dreamers and schemers and people who wanted to make a quick buck.
Developers like Henry Flagler came to the outskirts of the Everglades, creating metropolitan cities like Miami, Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, and as the population grew, the fresh water from the Everglades became the perfect water supply. To these American settlers, everything was great, until the population got too big. People like activist Marjorie Stoneman Douglas started realizing all the development had been disrupting the ecosystem all along, and was now threatening endangered species and the new city's water supply.
She recognized that it was a river of grass. It wasn't just water sitting there and sawgrass that happened to be inside the water, that it was an entire ecosystem that worked together.
But the famous writer wasn't working alone.
One gentleman who worked tirelessly in the early days to establish the park was Ernest Coe.
In 1928, activists like Ernest Coe came together with a plan to protect the Everglades. Coe wrote a letter to the government proposing for the Everglades to be named a national park, and after years of efforts, Congress bought in. Partially. Lawmakers passed legislation to establish a national park in the Everglades, but it didn't protect the entire area. On December 6, 1947, this section of the Everglades officially became a national park. But people kept trying to control and divert the flow of water in the Everglades by building close to 2,000 miles of canals and levees along with 16 major water pumping stations. And those changes continued to negatively affect the ecosystem, to the point where half of it was gone and the other half was left damaged.
It is a place that was significantly altered and impacted by human activity, and that's why we're working to restore it nowadays.
Restoration efforts began in the 1970s after Congress declared that the federal government is responsible for protecting endangered and threatened species and critical habitat. And for more than half a century now, humans have been trying to undo the damage they've done to the Florida Everglades.
It's hard to imagine it now that we know how important water is to the Everglades. But about a century ago, officials deemed this ecosystem worthless because of its water. And they came up with various plans to drain it in an effort to use the vast land for agriculture and as a place for people to live. They tried this for decades and in the process managed to destroy almost half of the Everglades and left the other half an ecological mess.
You know, we've had this abusive relationship with our natural surroundings. And the Everglades, it's this place that we essentially, destroyed half of it and we've crippled the other half.
We have caused a lot of damage to it over time. And that was due to development interests. It was due to a number of different political factors back in the day.
Once people realized the huge damage they had done to the ecosystem, they launched an equally huge effort to try to restore it.
And now we're doing the largest environmental restoration project in the history of the planet.
The Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, or CERP, is legislation that was passed in the year 2000 to repair the damaged Everglades over the course of 30 years.
What it does is it sets forth a framework for how we are going to undo the damage that we've done to the Everglades when we drained the swamp.
This level of restoration effort has never been tried anywhere else in the world.
The plan includes more than 60 individual initiatives aimed at restoring, protecting, and preserving the historic water flow that was disrupted. This vast environmental undertaking is critical to the area's biodiversity, flood control, and fresh water supply.
Everglades restoration is about water conservation. It's about rehydrating the Everglades and providing for the needs of all our coastal waters. Ensuring the right quantity and quality of water is making its way all the way down to Florida Bay and the Florida Keys.
But many think restoring the historic flow is simply impossible.
We've developed in places where flow used to be, and now as a result, we cannot restore in those areas.
But the project has faced a lot of tough challenges that are expected to delay its implementation, especially over the past year.
We had Hurricane Ian, which decimated the west coast of Florida in very serious ways. And when we have situations like that, they're unpredictable, and we have to pivot and we have to adjust.
The Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan is not only the largest in the world, but also the most expensive one. Initially projected to cost about $8 billion, it has now more than doubled in cost.
We're spending $20 billion, and that's not Park Service money or your money. This is the American people's money.
Many experts think it's worth it.
We know that Everglades restoration is our best defense to rising seas and storm surge and climate change impacts. So we're talking about a system that is absolutely essential to restore.
And it is one of the few projects that has received unequivocal support from all political parties.
We're seeing that right now, right? President Biden is providing historic levels of federal investment, and meanwhile, Governor Ron DeSantis is also providing historic levels of state investment in Everglades restoration.
Quality of water crosses all boundaries, all parties, all interests. It's something that's just, so basic to us as humans.
Besides being the largest and the most expensive, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan is also one of the most important.
The classic line, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas used to say it, is that the Everglades is a test. If we pass, we may get to keep the planet. It's essentially a test of our willingness to step back and say that it's not all about us.
Reporting for UMTV, I'm Melanie Lowe.
The Everglades is one of the most critical ecosystems in the world, with a wide range of flora, fauna, and wildlife. Currently, more than 60 animals, like the alligators that live in this water here, and over 160 native seed-bearing plants are on the list of endangered or threatened species.
The Florida Everglades is home to more than 1,500 animal and plant species. These include more than 360 species of birds, 300 species of both fresh and saltwater fish, some 50 reptile species, 40 mammal species, and about 750 native seed-bearing plants. And the Everglades is the only place in the United States where you can see some of these species in the wild. The Everglades is also the most important tropical wading bird breeding ground in North America. The park provides critical foraging and breeding habitat for 16 species of wading birds such as egrets, herons, and ibises.
Everglades National Park was the first national park that was officially protected for biodiversity and not just scenery.
But over the past century, the ecosystem has lost more than 90% of its wading bird population, and dozens of Everglades species are considered endangered and threatened.
The Everglades has been protected for so long, and during that entire time, it has been the safest harbor for some of the most endangered species that we have, not only in Florida, but in North America.
Some of the animals on the endangered species list are the Florida panther, which is the largest and most endangered mammal in North America, American alligator and American crocodile, manatee, snail kite, wood stork, various turtles and tortoises, and Florida bonneted bat. And some of the plants on the endangered list are Florida prairie clover, Florida Bristol fern, Everglades bully, and Cape sable thoroughwort. One of the main threats to the Everglades species is urbanization and agricultural development, which has resulted in serious habitat loss, something that authorities are trying to undo.
The work that we do as stewards of these places, particularly when it comes to endangered species, is mostly habitat work. Our philosophy is that when you create a good habitat, whether marine or terrestrial, all the species, not just the ones that are threatened and endangered, are going to have the best chance at survival.
Invasive species are another serious threat to the native flora and fauna of the Everglades. About 1.7 million acres of the Everglades have been invaded by non-native plants. One of the biggest threats is an Australian swamp tree called Melaleuca. It was planted in the Everglades in 1905 when efforts to drain the ecosystem were in full swing. Melaleuca literally sucks the wet out of wetlands.
Now there are tens of thousands of acres of Melaleuca in the Everglades, and they're this disastrous invasive species. We're spending tens of millions of dollars to try to get rid of it. And it just doesn't like to die.
So how do we solve this problem? It all goes back to restoration efforts.
We cannot throw in the towel. We need to continue applying pressure just so that we can give the native environment the best chance possible to do well by itself.
And one of the most endangered species, not just in the Everglades, but in the world, is the Florida panther. Ryan Marshall has been trying to track down some panthers for weeks. Ryan, why is it so hard?
Bailey, this is a sign that visitors to the Everglades will see on the roads inside the park. It warns them to beware of crossing panthers. But it would actually be a miracle if anyone were to see a panther in the wild, because currently there are about only 200 of them left. Hidden in the Everglades and Big Cypress National Preserve is the remaining population of Florida's big cat. The Florida panther once roamed across the entire southeastern United States, but the panther's habitat has been destroyed through urban development and is now only a small fraction located in southern Florida. And over the last couple hundred years, the apex predator's population decreased to around 20 individuals left in the wild in the 1970s. The small population and limited gene pool forced biologists and conservationists to take some extreme measures to ensure the species' survival.
And we made the very difficult decision to bring in 6 female Texas cougars. We released them in the wild. We let them breed one time, and then we removed them.
And while these efforts have helped raise the population to around 200 wild Florida panthers, the species is still considered one of the most endangered mammals in North America.
They're so saturated in the existing preserved lands now, and they've got pressures coming, like I said, from development on all sides. They need to move northward, and they need to be able to move northward safely into other areas, other large forest tracts and preserves.
As development in Florida has boomed over the last 50 years, the urban sprawl has led to small side roads being built through Florida panther territory. And as a result, road collisions are the #1 cause of death for Florida's big cat.
It's basically the areas around Naples continuing to expand eastward. And as these small roads that used to not get much traffic, when they build more and more housing developments, all of a sudden they have a lot of traffic on them. And you have panthers that are growing in numbers and they're moving that way too. And those areas where those roads overlap, they have no protections to keep panthers from running out onto the road like I-75 does.
For decades, the Florida panther breeding range has been limited to south of the Caloosahatchee River, leading to saturated territories. But in 2020, the first female panther and her kittens were seen north of the river. Biologists and conservationists have proposed a plan to allow more panthers and other endangered wildlife to safely move north of the river through the use of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, a web of private and public connected lands across the state that secures access for roaming wildlife.
That corridor is what enables animals to travel throughout the state uninterrupted. And we're working with all kinds of people, Florida ranchers, cattle ranchers, agricultural people, to maintain that corridor. People think about the ranchers and the agricultural people as kind of like the enemies of conservation. In reality, they're not. They're providing huge conservation easements that allow these animals, from the Florida panther to deer to bear, to be able to move up and down the state.
And many of these ranchers are strong supporters of the corridor and the protection of Florida's wildlife.
It's not all about the panther. It's about where the panther lived. If we save the panther, we have to save his habitat.
But some ranchers believe they are not being paid enough compensation in cases where panthers prey on cattle and other livestock.
We can't just save the panther and forget all the people that are going to sustain that food supply for that panther.
The Florida Wildlife Corridor Act was signed in 2021, and an expansion to the bill has been approved in 2023. And biologists and conservationists hope the corridor might be the solution in saving the Florida panthers.
If we can get these ranchers to understand, we get these panthers to start migrating north of the Caloosahatchee, and that panther range extends, I think the panthers have a positive future here in Florida.
For UMTV, I'm Ryan Marshall.
Besides hundreds of native species who live in the Everglades, the park is also home to many invasive species, including plants such as Brazilian pepper and Australian pine, and animals such as tegu lizards, wild boars, and lionfish, among others. They all pose a significant threat to the ecosystem by taking over it and driving native species out of existence. And without a doubt, the worst invasive animal in the Everglades is the Burmese python. Jaira Rivero joins us now with more. Jaira?
Guys, the Burmese python is indeed the biggest threat to the native species here in the Everglades. Nobody knows how many of these constrictive snakes live in the area, but estimates say it's in the hundreds of thousands. The pythons can grow very large, some up to 20 feet, and they don't have any natural predators. So it is up to humans to try and rid the Everglades of these invasive snakes.
The python is a very charismatic, it is a beautiful animal, but it doesn't belong here.
The Burmese python is native to parts of Asia, and it was introduced to Florida in the late 1980s when people started importing exotic pets. But when the pet snakes grew too big for their owners, many were dumped into the Everglades.
People did not understand that when an exotic animal gets loose in a natural environment, it could in fact survive. And if it survives and then it thrives, then it could take over the landscape and displace the natural flora and fauna that exists.
With no natural predators, the snakes are multiplying and eating everything they can.
The National Academy of Science basically indicted the python for being responsible for the collapse of the small mammal population.
These aren't captive bred snakes that are eating once a month or once every 2 months. They'll eat any chance they can get.
Nobody knows exactly how many Burmese pythons live in the Everglades, but some estimates put their numbers as high as 500,000. Each female snake can lay up to 100 eggs every year, and these snakes can live an average of 20 years.
It's a problem that has been testing us now for several decades, and it's also a problem that has been very, very difficult to get our arms around.
The state of Florida has implemented several different initiatives to rid the Everglades of Burmese pythons. One of those is a competition called the Annual Python Challenge, which brings hunters from all over the United States to the Everglades to find and catch as many of these snakes as possible. But while the competition certainly raises awareness for the issue, the participants manage to catch just a few dozen snakes at a time. So officials are also calling in on the public to help with the python eradication by using an app called I've Got One.
It allows you to take a picture, mark the location with a GPS, just dropping a pin and letting us know where you removed the snake from.
The most successful initiative to catch Burmese pythons to date is the hiring of 100 contractors whose sole job is to hunt and kill the snakes.
Yeah, so we get paid minimum wage, and then we get paid per snake. So the first 4 feet of the snake is $50, and then every additional foot after that is $25.
And we're basically hunting the hunters. We're going out after them when they're moving. They're looking for food, and we're looking for them.
Since the contractor program began in 2017, hunters like Ryan and Donna have removed about 10,000 pythons from the Everglades. But while that might sound promising, the consensus is that the Everglades would never be completely free of Burmese pythons. For UMTV, I'm Jaira Rivero.
Behind this gate is what was supposed to be the biggest airport in the world. It was envisioned back in the late 1960s as a massive global hub with multiple runways that would welcome supersonic passenger planes from all over the world, right here in the middle of the Everglades. But that never happened, and today it's known as the greatest airport that never was.
Holed up in the swamps of the Everglades lies a ghost of a dream that never came to be. Construction for the Dade Collier Airport started in 1968, and it was Florida's plan to take off into the future.
7-hole short of runway 31 right, you're behind it.
Somebody even back then realized what was going to happen today, which was we were going to have millions of people move into the area.
And with a big population came a need for big air travel and cargo centers. And Miami-Dade Port Authority thought the perfect place for it was in the swamps just outside Everglades National Park.
It would mean that Dade County would be the first in solving the big problems that we have today in urban and mass transportation.
And at the same time, the Boeing company was building a supersonic passenger plane, the Boeing 2707. With the takeoff blast so loud, it was said that it could shatter windows within a 5-mile radius of the plane.
Anything you're going to build, you're going to have to build far away.
And in 1969, the spot was decided, and all the way from the White House, President Richard Nixon pressed his big red button to send the first blast of dynamite, beginning airport construction 6 miles north of Everglades National Park.
And with that explosion began the reawakening of a movement that kind of had gone dormant, the birth of the new environmental movement in South Florida.
Just 2 years later, in 1971, the Boeing 2707 project was killed, and the plane never made a commercial flight. But the 2707's fail to lift off wasn't the real reason for the airport's failure.
If you build this jetport, it's going to kill this national treasure.
Conservationists realized a massive airport would lead to a lot more. The Department of Transportation was dreaming up plans for massive highways across the state and metro rails coming in from Tampa and Miami to bring passengers, which is where Everglades activist Marjorie Stoneman Douglas came into action.
The jetport is the beginning of the next 50 years of her life, and fighting these fights and creating the Friends of the Everglades.
Friends of the Everglades is now a massive conservation group that works on all sorts of restoration projects. But back in the 60s, its first and only goal was to take on the Port Authority and shut down the Everglades jetport.
They were openly hostile to people like Ms. Douglas and Art and me.
You're not ready to say at this time that the commercial airport in the Everglades will not be built?
I am not, no sir, you better believe it.
But eventually, he came around. And it was in major part to a man named Nathaniel Reed. Reed was the Assistant Secretary of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks at the Department of Interior, and his team created this, the environmental impact of the Big Cypress Swamp jetport.
Richard Nixon, the president, he didn't give a damn about the environment. But Nat Reed, he was able to change their minds.
Once the federal government pulled their support from the project, the Miami Port Authority stopped construction. But left behind was a massive runway in the middle of the swamp, and a reminder that this land was in danger.
The jetport is actually what crystallized the movement that resulted in the creation of Big Cypress National Preserve.
The Cypress National Preserve is 729,000 acres of land that surround the airport on all sides, and it holds the major watersheds that provide water to the entire national park. The death of the jetport brought on competing mindsets. Environmentalists wanted to make the land an extension of Everglades National Park. But the people that lived there, like hunters, fishers, and native tribes, protested. They were living on Big Cypress because they had gotten kicked off the land in Everglades National Park in 1947. And they wanted to protect the land, but also keep their homes and businesses. So the groups came up with a big compromise.
It wasn't going to be a park. It was a new breed of cat. It was going to be called a preserve.
Naming the land a preserve meant residents already living there could keep their homes, and Miccosukee and Seminole tribes could continue to use the land as they always did. Plus, sportsmen could still make a living off the woods and water by leading fishing or eco-tours. But the land was protected from any commercial development. Today, the jetport still stands, but it doesn't look like much. It's just this one building, essentially an office with a couple radios, a small staff, and a window that overlooks the runway. No fueling, maintenance, or FAA control tower.
It's just purely touch and goes, approach.
The airport works mostly as a training facility for new pilots and only sees a few planes a day.
It's funny that it sits there quiet, but boy did it make a big boom and jumpstart a lot of things.
And now, conservationists say its biggest use is as a symbol, a slab of pavement that serves as a reminder that this land is meant to be protected. Anna Kuhn, UMTV.
Well, we are having a lot of fun here at the Anhinga Trail, but our time together celebrating the 75th anniversary of one of the most important and fascinating places in the world, the Florida Everglades, has come to an end.
As you've seen today, this magnificent park is truly a national and global treasure, and it's our responsibility to ensure that it's around for generations to come.
But that's only possible if people come together and help save this unique place. That, combined with the ongoing restoration efforts and the power of Mother Nature, will allow this national park to shape the legacy of South Florida.
Thank you so much for joining us on this wonderful journey through the Florida Everglades.
We truly hope you enjoyed this culmination of months of work and research combined with nearly 5,000 years of history. Thank you and stay safe.